Now I'll introduce our speaker. Bill Braniff is the Director of START and a Professor of the Practice at the University of Maryland. He previously served as the Director of Practitioner Education at West Point's Combating Terrorism Center. He's also a graduate of the United States Military Academy and was an officer in the United States Army. Bill, you can take it away.
Thank you, Erin. Thanks for joining us today, everybody. I really appreciate it. Today we're going to talk about the contrasting visions for global jihadism offered by both Al-Qaeda and the so-called Islamic State. This might seem like an interesting topic given how much we're focused currently on domestic extremism in the United States, and for good reason. But there is still a global competition out there within the Salafi jihadist community for leadership. And so we're going to examine what that competition means in really primarily Muslim majority countries. So I'm going to share my screen now and we will dive in. Okay. I've got on this title slide two acronyms: Al-Qaeda and its associated movement, and the Islamic State and its associated movement. Now, that's not an acronym you've likely seen before. It's something that I use to try to highlight the fact that much like the Al-Qaeda organization is really no longer best understood as a corporate structure. Al-Qaeda is one part organization, one part associated and affiliated groups, and one part inspiration, right? So it's this multifaceted movement. Similarly, the Islamic State was never really defined by the territorial boundaries of the Caliphate. That drew our attention, and it made us focus on Iraq and Syria for good reason, but it also simultaneously distracted us from this movement-esque nature of the Islamic State, and I think to our detriment. So I'm going to compare and contrast these two movements, and then talk about some implications for the competition, and then what I think we need to do at a grand strategic level to respond. So let's start with an overview of Al-Qaeda and its sort of vision. Al-Qaeda is truly a revolutionary organization. Let me, get the chat function up. Okay. Al-Qaeda really is a revolutionary organization in terms of Muslim extremist organizations. So whereas most Muslim extremist organizations historically engaged in political violence to overthrow their own governments or to kick an occupying force out of the country that they operated in, Al-Qaeda turned its violence against the so-called far enemy, right? So the United States, the West, not the near enemy, the local regimes that they wanted to overthrow. They did want to overthrow these regimes, but they thought that they first had to get the United States out of Muslim majority countries, to sever ties between the United States and the governments in those countries. And so it used violence against the United States in part to awaken the masses, right? To awaken the Muslim community to this combination of local tyrannical rule and foreign support from the United States, right? It was this combination that they saw as problematic. And so the 9/11 attacks are really best understood not about us, but about trying to awaken the masses, to get the Muslim worlds to recognize this problem. The strategy that they employed was one of protracted attrition or exhaustion, vexation warfare, right? So Al-Qaeda did not expect to defeat the United States in a pitched conventional battle. Instead, it tried to, and continues to, work through local groups on the ground that are already mobilizing to engage in violence, and just redirect a portion of that violence away from near enemy targets and towards far enemy targets, right? Whether that's supply chains, embassies, tourist attractions, the kinds of places where Western interests will be found. And the idea here is that if they can get just enough violence from these already mobilizing groups to target the far enemy, to target us, when an American turns on their news channel of choice, they're going to see another attack in another Muslim country against US interests. And they're going to eventually write their congressperson and say, listen, why are we spending so much money overseas? Why are we entangled with these other governments? The Muslim world is too backwards. It's too violent. It's too broken. We can't fix it. Our resources are better used at home. So the idea here is that through the use of violence, Al-Qaeda is endeavoring to get Americans to change their own cost-benefit calculus to remaining engaged in the Muslim world. And if we choose to withdraw, then those already mobilizing local actors that Al-Qaeda is reorienting, their violence can be put to better use against their near enemy targets. Those countries can be, those governments can be toppled, and a Muslim state can be established in their place. So this is a very rational strategy. It's intended to play out over the long term, right? Al-Qaeda is historically understood as a patient organization. When they talk about things like the Caliphate, it's a rhetorical device. It's a target that you hang way out on the horizon so that groups in the Philippines and in Central Asia and in North Africa and in the Middle East can all march in generally the same direction towards that far off goal, even though their situations are all very, very different on the ground. Bin Laden especially was very cautious about the idea of reestablishing the caliphate. One of his important leaders, however, in the organization, Saif al-Adil, was much more willing to imagine an expedited timeline, and in fact worked with several others to put this sort of a plan on paper to establish the caliphate in the mid-2010s. He envisioned this happening in Syria for reasons we can talk about. And importantly, he socialized this idea with Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, right? This was the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq. Zarqawi and bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, they had a very fraught relationship. Al-Qaeda core was not really a big fan of Zarqawi. They just needed somebody operating in the Levant with the Al-Qaeda mantle. And it was Saif al-Adil who encouraged Al-Qaeda's senior leadership to embrace Zarqawi for this role. Given the likely demise of Ayman al-Zawahiri, Saif al-Adil looks to be the incumbent or the successor to Zawahiri to lead Al-Qaeda. And if that's true, the idea of some kind of rapprochement between the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda looks more favorable as a potential outcome than it has over the last decade. When Al-Qaeda is on the ground, working by, with, and through local organizations, they compromise on ideology. Right? They, despite all of the rhetoric, this is an organization that is much more pragmatic in practice than idealistic. And so it works with local organizations. It doesn't demand that they subscribe to Al-Qaeda's interpretation of Islamic law. And as a result, they're able to sort of compromise with these groups and slowly try to reorient the ideology of these organizations through the processes of socialization and training camps and these kinds of things. But really, they're about slowly reorienting instead of demanding submission. When this plays out, Al-Qaeda has, I think, one of the questions we can ask ourselves is, how is it that this organization is around having fought two superpowers head on, right? First, the Soviet Union and the United States over decades, right? Al-Qaeda was formally established in August of 1988, right? So this is a 32-year-old organization. And the question is, how has it survived? It was never a large organization. It was always small, right? Numbering in the hundreds of individuals. How could this small organization possibly survive that long? And I think the primary answer is that they've found safe haven and oxygen to fuel their fire in conflict zones around the Muslim world. Right? Conflict zones provide tremendous temporal and strategic depth for this global or transnational movement. And what happens in a conflict zone is that local actors start to create compelling narratives to mobilize people to fight. There's a casus belli, there's a reason to mobilize towards violence. Oftentimes outside powers have an interest in supporting the outcome, right, or a certain outcome in that fight. And so foreign resources will pour in to conflict zones. There needs to be some sort of logistical structure in the periphery of that conflict zone to take in those resources and deploy them on the battle space. And this is exactly where Al-Qaeda has found longevity and safe haven over the decades, on the periphery of conflict zones, other people's conflicts. They've created a recipe that other groups have started to follow. So now other organizations also pour into these peripheral places. They're often co-located. So Al-Qaeda has, for example, in the anti-Soviet jihad, was co-located with dozens of organizations and was slowly able to network and indoctrinate among that constellation of organizations. Slowly, they can try to reorient these actors to this far enemy ideology or strategy, rather. And of course, this process is cyclical, right? Resources come in, inputs come in, outputs go out the other end of this war economy. And what's happened over years is that Al-Qaeda has proliferated, right? Its transnational global jihad has proliferated around the world, jumping from conflict zone to conflict zone, sometimes causing new conflicts, sometimes just benefiting from new conflicts or existing conflicts. But as a result, Al-Qaeda has really become this transnational part of the Muslim extremist movement. And this process, of course, isn't unique to Al-Qaeda, right? And so we know that the Islamic State is going through a similar proliferation geographically. And so we'll compare that in a moment. When we to talk about the Islamic State's grand strategy, they didn't use far enemy violence to awaken the masses. Instead, it was the rhetorical declaration of the Caliphate, and then the actual instantiation of the Caliphate in Iraq and Syria that brought in so many individuals from around the world interested, right? 30 to 40,000 in partaking in this state building exercise. It might seem paradoxical, but despite the fact that the Islamic State was a more lethal, more brutal organization than Al-Qaeda, it appealed to a broader swath of society, right? So we had elderly, and we had young women, and we had individuals who went to not just to go fight in the Islamic State. And that seems kind of counterintuitive, right? How is it that this more brutal organization was able to bring in individuals who weren't necessarily there to fight? And the answer is that they had a quote unquote positive vision of the future, right? They were claiming to be building a utopia, and they wanted people to come build its institutions. Whereas Al-Qaeda really offered this nihilistic vision of martyrdom and death, period, full stop, right? To be a part of Al-Qaeda is to martyr yourself for a cause so that maybe, God willing, one day in the far future, there might be a caliphate. And the Islamic State turned that on its head. The strategy is also quite different, right? Despite being a franchise of Al-Qaeda, Zarqawi's vision for Al-Qaeda in Iraq was fundamentally different, and it contradiction to bin Laden's vision for what the organization should be doing. Zarqawi declared war on everybody, right? Anyone who didn't subordinate to his organization was a legitimate target. And that idea remains true in for the Islamic State today, despite the leadership turnovers. It remains an organization that doesn't conceive of the Muslim world as 1.4 billion. It conceives of the Muslim world as a very, very small number of individuals who are willing to do what it takes to usher in the apocalypse. And this very, very narrow interpretation has allowed them to justify the murder of scores and scores of Muslims, not just in Iraq and Syria, but obviously in Iraq and Syria. The X factor here is that they were able to play on sectarian tension in Iraq and in Syria They were able to use the Assad regime as a boogeyman to bring in individuals willing to join the most lethal and brutal organization in order to overthrow the Assad regime, or in order to push back on Shia death squads in Iraq, or the Shia-led government in Iraq. Right, so they very cleverly manipulated sectarian tension through violence, forcing individuals to mobilize on both sides of the equation, right? If you were in a Shia village, you had to mobilize or die. And if you were in a Sunni village, similarly, if you didn't subordinate to the Islamic State, they might go to war with you. But if you could somehow avoid that fate, you couldn't necessarily guarantee that a Shia force wasn't going to come into your neighborhood. And so they created a war in which there was no sidelines. Right? And this is the fundamental difference and the reason why we saw such gruesome levels of violence in Iraq and Syria. There were no sidelines. Everyone had to basically fight or flee. Their communications patterns are obviously different. They represent this much more bold kind of vision, right? The caliphate is here now. It's an obligation. It's a geopolitical reality. We're going to remain and expand. And when they talked about Islamic law, they alleged to be uncompromising, right? And they had this disturbed kind of performance legitimacy, right? They weren't compromising on God. They weren't compromising on God's law. And they were able to sort of paint other organizations like Al-Qaeda as hypocritical for not living up to their interpretation of Sharia. Obviously, this organization is not righteous. This organization did not live up to the ideals that it purported to, but in its propaganda, it certainly tried to portray this piety of a muscular kind, and basically align their deeds with their actions in the propaganda space. This has obviously changed quite a bit now, given the loss of the territorial caliphate. And so what we see now is really, in terms of operations, just the exhortation of violence in as many locations as possible. Aaron Zellin writes about the method for expanding into new locations, starting with intelligence operations to understand the human terrain, conducting assassinations, or otherwise removing individuals who might be obstacles to getting an economic foothold, for self-sustainment, and then using that foothold to exhort violence. They continue to use intercommunal violence, right? Whether that's sectarian or another kind of intercommunal divisions that they can seize on to foment instability. And they can now use their rivalry with Al-Qaeda and its associated movement on the ground as a useful form of competition that can help them drive resources and drive mobilization. And they remain able to conduct really global, somewhat coordinated campaigns of violence, right? They announce a campaign on social media, and we see upticks in violence throughout their various affiliates for a period of time, right? So it's not command and control. It's certainly not because they're coordinating the individual acts of violence, but when they do speak from their central media organ calling for violence, we do see a response from affiliated organizations around the world. Big focus on freeing individuals from prisons or refugee camps. In Baghdadi's last speech, we heard a call for attrition, right? So attrition warfare, the same kind of strategy playing out or being utilized for these decades by Al-Qaeda. And so really, I think what we're starting to see is a kind of tactical alignment between these two organizations, right? On the ground, it might not look, they might not look very much different from one another compared to in 2014, 2015, 2016, when obviously they were behaving very differently because of the territorial caliphate. But we still see this idea of a global competition. Again, the X factor here was the use of sectarian violence to gain a foothold. And we unfortunately are seeing this same kind of process play out. So I've got a question here from Mr. or Mrs. Patterson. As Al-Qaeda has been effective in sending terrorists, SME mentors, advisors to affiliate locations to boost local players in complex attacks, has research found a correlation of tactics between continents? For example, Taliban Haqqani and Al-Shabaab, similar tactics and methods. So it has been argued that qualitatively that the use of complex suicide attacks does travel, so to speak, with Al-Qaeda mentors and advisors, and that we see a changing of tactics, techniques, and procedures when there's an affiliation between Al-Qaeda and a local group on the ground. North Africa is one example where we saw the Salafist group for preaching in combat, which had been using very precise assassinations of political and law enforcement figures in Algiers, start to adopt things like indiscriminate suicide bombings in the capital and VBID attacks. So that's often, I think, held up as an example of this. We certainly know that Al-Qaeda's, one of the things it's been able to do is help through, by sending subject matter experts into training environments, and that they would bring this idea of suicide terrorism sort of with them as a very effective tool. So I think that there are good reasons to sort of accept that assumption. However, I don't know that I've seen, and I don't think we have done a formal study of tactical perfusion and to see that this bears out empirically. So Jeffrey Allen asks, how would you explain the social organization of ISIS supporters in camps like Al-Hol in northern Syria? Are the enforcers among Al-Hol's residents carrying out violence against others in the community to silence the doubters who may not believe in the return of the territorial caliphate? Are the enforcers concerned about competition from Al-Qaeda? So from what I understand about the camps is that there are absolutely enforcers who are penalizing individuals who aren't living up to their interpretation of Islamic law, and who are turning their back on Islamic State. There's a lot of disinformation inside the camps. The belief that Baghdadi isn't really dead, for example, these kinds of ideas are circulating. And in terms of competition from Al-Qaeda within the camps, not to my knowledge, right? The individuals are primarily associated with the Islamic State. And so I think it's not really about a competition within those environments like it might be outside of them. What role do you think tech companies should play in slowing and stopping Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State? Have they been successful? Oh, hey, Chris Grandy, good to see you. So this is a big question. I think I might want to circle back to that in sort of the third part of this talk, because it fits in with some of my recommendations. Sean is asking, how specifically does Islamic State portray itself as pious? How is it trying to counter increasingly well-known information about its abuses? So the Islamic State is able to use some well-understood scripture to its advantage, and specifically the idea of the strangers. So there's a passage that says that Islam was born into this world as something strange, and it will return to something strange sort of in the end times. And what this is referring to is this idea that there will be a saved sect of Muslims, a small minority of Muslims who will return to the proper practice of Islam, and they will look different from the rest of the Muslim community, not because they're wrong, but because they're right. That the rest of the Muslim community will have sort of gone astray, have lost the path, or have gone off the path, and that this saved sect in the end will be the ones who will deliver the final apocalyptic battle between the Muslim world and the non-Muslim world. Zarqawi called himself, gave himself the nickname of the stranger. The group has really embraced this idea that as armies and nations turn against them, it's actually an indication that they are pious and that they have the right interpretation. So they've been able to sort of play this sort of rhetorical, use this rhetorical device, and it's appealing for a small number of individuals and completely unappealing to most, right? Who, we think about 30 to 40,000 foreign fighters who went into Iraq and Syria when millions of people went the other direction, right? So again, in no way do these groups actually represent the Muslim community. The Muslim community rejects them. It's just a question of, the small numbers of individuals who find them to be compelling and who then can, conduct these egregious acts of violence. Okay, I'm gonna just move on and then we'll get back to some of the questions. I really appreciate the questions, so thank you. This is the end result of this cyclical process of going into conflict zones or new locations to create new conflicts and sort of living off of these conflict zones like a parasite. You can see that Al-Qaeda has proliferated to over 50 countries throughout its several decades of existence, but they were operational in about 12 or 13 in 2019. The Islamic State, by comparison, and its precursor organizations, in still nearly 20 years, but in much less time, really, with the declaration of the Caliphate in 2014, you see this massive, rapid spike in the number of countries in which they've been operational. So outpacing or eclipsing Al-Qaeda with about 56 total countries and operational in over 30 in 2019. And so there's this narrative that we've defeated Daesh, right? That the global coalition to defeat Daesh has in fact defeated Daesh. They were operational in 31 countries in 2019. Right now, they're clearly nowhere near not conducting violence nearly the scale that they were conducting inside of Iraq and Syria. But with this many organizations out there, giving their allegiance or their affiliation, and with veterans from the Islamic State sort of circulating in other organizations, clearly, right? If Al-Qaeda is 31, 32 years old, we can expect that the so-called Islamic State will be around for a very long time, right? They're not defeated in the sense, if we understand them as a movement. Right? So what does this mean? It means that throughout the world, there are small organizations affiliated with either Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State competing with one another. And I don't really mean competing for airtime on cable news channels. I mean competing for the next recruit and the next donor dollar. And this competition, if terrorism literature or theory bears out, and it's not an uncontested hypothesis, but there's this idea of outbidding, that when terrorist organizations are on the ground competing with one another, they compete through violence, right? And the organizations that are most capable in inflicting violence are the ones who are most likely to gain support, whether that's recruits wanting to join those organizations or foreign sponsors wanting to sponsor those organizations. And when we look at least one START data set, the Big Allied and Dangerous data set, Victor Assal and Carl Rethemeier found that the single most important predictor of increasing group lethality over time was, in fact, competition on the ground. The second most important factor, however, was not competition, but collaboration. And what we have with both the Al-Qaeda movement and the Islamic State movement are two competing franchises composed of collaborating organizations, right, and individuals. And so what we have are sort of the first and second risk factors for increasing violence over time. I'm not suggesting that in every location where these organizations are, we're going to see, a linear sort of increase of violence, but given the number of locations in which these groups are competing, I think there's certainly cause for concern and instability. So how might this play out, right? If this goes very poorly, what can we potentially expect? Destabilizing violence. We can expect that weak nation states that may already be struggling under sectarian pressures right? So if you're a Sunni majority country or nation and you're concerned about Iran and you're concerned about Lebanese Hezbollah and you're concerned about the Houthis in Yemen, you might not have the resources, or you might not have the appetite or the interest in going after Sunni extremists if those Sunni extremists are also fighting against this Shia crescent, right? If your concern is primarily of a sectarian nature, even if you don't like the Sunni extremists and the Sunni extremists don't like you might have utility for them, or you might just not have the ability to go down, get that far down your to-do list. And so this could cause or could give time and opportunity for both Al-Qaeda and the Islamic and its associated movement, and the Islamic State and its associated movement to further manipulate sectarian tension and create wider conflicts. And if that were to happen, or what are some worst case outcomes? And I use worst case as a thought exercise. This is not intended to be a prediction nor fear mongering, but I think it's important for us to understand this competition in the context of sectarianism in the modern Middle East, and then think about what that might mean. So the first worst case scenario is that between these various sectarian conflict zones, we have a bunch of small hot spots. If the Islamic State can pour enough gasoline on those fires, can it create a broader regional civil war, or continue the civil war and sort of see spillover into Lebanon, right? For example, if the war in Syria created the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, what would a regional sectarian civil war do, right? I mean, the human costs would be impossible to calculate. But there's these other things that are happening, right? As this transnational threat manifests, we actually see countries respond in ways that are often sort of counterproductive to the international system as it was created after World Wars I and II to support the free movement of goods and labor, right? We see sort of isolationist tendencies. We see transnational partnerships often ending instead of growing. And we see countries start to feel like they have to act out unilaterally instead of through multinational bodies. And so all of this sort of starts to sort of work against the international system that is so beneficial to Western capitalist democracies. And so there's the immediate massive humanitarian costs, and then there are these other sort of insidious or subversive political responses that I think actually are counterproductive. The second, as the Islamic State continues to engage in wanton violence, might it make Al-Qaeda and its associated movement, organizations in that sphere, look more mainstream and legitimate by comparison? Right? Al-Qaeda was actively trying to take advantage of this. It's called the fringe effect. They were sort of holding Islamic State out as beyond the pale, but saying that Al-Qaeda, we've never lost our eyes on the true enemies of Islam. There's this intentional positioning of themselves as more legitimate and mainstream. This is not in any way just some mistake that Muslim majority countries can make, right? In this country, we've seen very prominent thinkers and war fighters talk about how in the context of the Syrian civil war, that a group like Jabhat al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda affiliate, was actually our best chance at affecting the outcome of the war. Jabhat al-Nusra, despite being associated with Al-Qaeda previously, was fighting both the Assad regime and the Islamic State. And so very pragmatic people engaging in real politic might look at Al-Qaeda related organizations as useful for them among a set of really bad options. And that pragmatism, of course, runs the risk of mainstreaming these groups. And that, is obviously a disaster in the long run. The third, strategic surprise. So with this many pieces on the chessboard, it's very easy for one of them to catch us or others by surprise. there were very few people who thought Afghanistan was going to be a place that would serve as the home for the United States' longest war in its history. But I guess the point is, people often ask, well, where's the next place do you think that the Islamic State is going to sort of gain traction? And the answer is, I don't know. And that's the point. But when you think about how many associated or affiliated groups there are out there, what if one of them has a very capable leader? What if one of them stumbles into radiological material? What if one of them is able to destabilize a sovereign government? What if one of them sits on a strategic fault line? And the example I have here is the Sinai province, right? The Sinai province of the Islamic State, it sits on the border between the most populous Arab nation in the world and Israel. If they're able to either destabilize Cairo or incite a heavy-handed military response from Israel into sovereign Egypt, right? This could be cataclysmic in terms of the ability to create a sectarian conflict that forces people to mobilize, right? Now, I don't think that this is likely to happen, but the point is, we don't know necessarily where they're either going to get lucky or get good. And that's, I think, my largest concern. The last one is that ever increasing levels of violence convince the West to sever ties. And this, of course, is Al-Qaeda's grand strategy, but it really doesn't matter if it's Al-Qaeda conducting the violent attacks or an Islamic State affiliate conducting the violent attacks. To the American who turns on their news channel at night and sees another Muslim country with another Muslim attack against US interests, it's immaterial who the perpetrators are if it convinces us to take our ball and go home. And so I think we have to really remain cognizant that this is, in fact, a long-term war of attrition from the perspective of Al-Qaeda, that the Islamic State has adopted this going forward. And if we don't keep that in mind, we might, I think, fall victim to that strategy playing out. So this data comes from the Dr. Erin Miller and our global terrorism database. And she looked at the lifespan of groups versus movements. And what we see here is that terrorist organizations are weak. 66% or so survive less than 1 year. And new organizations are sort of always sort of coming into existence. Many, very few of them last very long. Movements, on the other hand, last a very long time. And this makes sense. This is an intuitive thing to say, but we don't actually create policy and counterterrorism practice around this reality, right? In the United States, we designate organizations, right? That's our unit of analysis, is the terrorist organization. Once we designate an organization, we then can unleash different governmental authorities against that organization. When you think about organizations, you think about winning, defeating the organization, right? You think about the organizations losing, and that kind of binary thinking leads us to very narrow counterterrorism responses. If instead we conceptualize these as movements, we know that movements are social phenomenon, right? We know that it's not just about disrupting a violent organization, that we have to open up our sort of whole society toolkit to get at these movements. It's a much more accurate framing of the challenge. And we are now facing, right, these two very, very violent, very geographically dispersed movements. So what do we do about all of this? Much like the idea of the organization versus a movement, I think we think we know what terrorism is, right? We think we know that it's about the threat of future violence is intended to create a psychological and political impact on an audience beyond the physical target of the attack, right? So we know that, but we actually don't create policy based on that understanding, right? We're so fixated on the violence and about stopping the next violent attack that we forget to allocate resources to blunting the psychological and political attractiveness of these groups, the impact of their violence when it does occur. And what we know from studying both Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State is that there will be a next attack, right? If we convince our societies that we're going to defeat or eradicate these organizations, and then a bomb goes off, we're actually breeding fragility into our society, right? I thought we had won, and then a bomb went off. That must mean that our government is illegitimate, that our counterterrorism community is not credible, and that these groups are really, really strong. Because I thought we defeated them, but they're still here, right? So we create these really unrealistic narratives. We set the standard for success unbelievably high for the government, and the standard for success so low for the terrorist movement that they can't help but succeed, right? Our response really has to be inherently political and psychological. We have to think about allocating resources to blunting the psychological and political impacts of these organizations, and not just disrupting the violent actions that these organizations engage in. And if we can do that, if we can actually blunt the psychological and political payoff of the next violent attack, over time we'll decrease the incentive for violence among activists who want to change society around them, right? If violence gives them the psychological and political impacts that they want, they'll continue to use violence, right? As opposed to disincentivizing the use of violence. And the thing about this kind of an approach is that it actually can be measured. If behavioral and social scientists measure things like public opinion all the time, and we can measure the effectiveness of these kinds of efforts. And so I'll talk about metrics in a second. So this is given this long-term threat, right? Al-Qaeda is 30 plus years old. We will be dealing with the Islamic State in 30 years. It might have a different name, but the movement will be here. Once we accept that, it suggests that we need a grand strategy. It suggests that 20 years after 9/11, just reacting to terrorism, just reacting to already mobilizing actors, doesn't matter how incredibly competent our military and law enforcement entities are, if our response to terrorism is literally just a reaction to already mobilizing violent actors, right? We're giving ourselves a very, very narrow window to be successful, and we have to be successful every time. And we're creating a really unsustainable counterterrorism footprint. And so, if we really want to think about this strategically, this is my humble offering for what that might look like. Before crafting a strategy, articulating a policy, passing a law, conducting an operation, launching a narrative campaign, or even covering a terrorist attack on cable news, we should ask ourselves, will this effort help empower the majority community in question to further marginalize the attractiveness and the political and psychological impact of violent extremism in that community? Right. Now, I've done something important here. I've changed the who the primary actor is, right? If we're talking about Muslim extremism, we're talking about Sunni extremists in the case of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. There's really only one community that can marginalize Sunni extremists, right? And that's the Sunni majority community, right? So the question is, what can we do to empower the Sunni majority community to marginalize Sunni extremists who claim to speak for Sunnis around the world, but don't, right? This is the fundamental question. If you think about this in the context of the United States, right, we also have a majority population that has within it a religious extremist movement, right, that's been around for a very long time. So the KKK is over 150 years old, right? It was a largely Presbyterian movement, especially in the second wave. They targeted not just African Americans, but also Jews and Catholics. So we had a Protestant extremist, excuse me, I said Presbyterian, Protestant extremist movement within our majority Protestant population. And the question, did we expect the African American community to defeat the KKK? Right, that's an unrealistic expectation. It had to really be marginalized from within white society. White society had to marginalize the attractiveness of this group or movement. And you're never done doing that, right? That doesn't, you don't win or lose. You just keep at it forever, trying to marginalize these groups every time they emerge, marginalize the attractiveness of the ideology. And this happens in classrooms, and it happens in our sort of arts and humanities. This happens in our family units. This happens in our policies over the long term. The idea that the United States is going to defeat Muslim extremism somehow from the outside has always been unrealistic and remains unrealistic. And so the question is, how do we empower the majority community in question to marginalize that extremist community in the fringe? And this, once you open the aperture and you start thinking about movements over the long term, and how to marginalize those extremist movements, you come up with a whole list of metrics that are measurable, right? There's a lot of criticism over the CVE, PVE paradigm. There's this argument, which I think is somewhat disingenuous, that we can't count the number of people who don't radicalize to violence. So we have no idea, no ability to determine whether or not CVE works, right? Whether a prevention program or an engagement program stops people from radicalizing. And since we can't count the number of people who didn't radicalize, we can't know if it works. We can't therefore invest resources in it. That again, I think it's suffering from this idea that what we're trying to do is just stop violence, instead of trying to blunt the political and the psychological impacts of violence and the attractiveness of the ideology, right? Those are things that we actually can measure. And so here's a list of some ways to measure whether or not a grand strategy of empowering majority communities to marginalize extremist communities within them, how we could determine over time if it were working, right? And so this to me is a much more realistic understanding of what it really means to respond to terrorism over time, and gets us ideally out of this kinetic cycle where we just continually mobilize our own violence to conduct disruptive violence against already mobilizing actors. That process, right, is unfortunately a reciprocal one and continues to beget more violence. So what are the implications here? To go back to the sort of the first part of the brief, and the where might it go? Where might the competition between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State go from here? We have to really think about sectarian tension as a very useful opportunity for Islamic State, especially to mobilize violence and figure out how to manage that sectarian conflict or competition, to cut off sectarianism as a source of appeal for violent extremists who play up that sectarian division. We really need to get away from thinking about terrorist organizations as our unit of analysis. It's counterproductive, I think, and while legally it might be necessary for high-end counterterrorism disruptions, it's not actually sufficient as a unit of analysis to minimize the threat of extremism over time. We focus very much on foreign fighters going into conflict zones for obvious reasons, but we spend less energy, I think, trying to prevent the bleed out, right? The veterans from that conflict zone from going to the next conflict zone. This travel from conflict zone to conflict zone is what has given Al-Qaeda 30 plus years of longevity, and it's really essential to try to thwart that those veterans from making it into the next conflict zone. Right, once they're there, leadership matters, that experience matters, and they're able to more effectively mobilize others. We have to think, I think, differently about how we engage with Sunni populations to marginalize Sunni extremists. That's not going to happen if Sunni majority communities are most concerned with Shia governments and populations, right? And then while we are rightly focused on domestic extremism in the United States, based on the empirical reality that domestic extremists our white supremacist movements are most active and lethal in the United States, there is still an incentive for both Al-Qaeda and Islamic State to conduct mass casualty attacks on Western targets, to remain relevant, as well as to continue to wage this attrition warfare. And so, we'll have to continue to guard against those XOR attacks into the United States from others outside, recognizing though that really not just our domestic terrorism problem, but our problem with Al-Qaeda and Islamic State related violent extremists is almost entirely a homegrown phenomenon. And so again, it's the social and political programs that are going to be most effective in marginalizing the number of individuals who ever get to the point of wanting to conduct those attacks. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and we can go to the Q&A.
All right, thanks, Bill.
All right.
So I think our first question, I might circle back around to the question you were talking about before from Chris Grandy.
Yeah.
What role do you think tech companies should play in the slowing or stopping of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State's use of their platforms? Do you think that they have been successful?
Yeah, so thanks, Chris, for the question. So I'm a member of the Independent Advisory Committee for the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism, the GIFCT. So this is the industry body that was created by Facebook, Google, YouTube, Microsoft, and Twitter. And the idea here is that these large companies have a lot of resources and have hired increasing numbers of individuals to try to tackle this problem. But the vast majority of the tech sector, these companies are very, very small. They don't have the resources to hire a terrorism expert, let alone, they might have 3 people or 10 people, working in the organization, but they have this massive scale ability to provide services to people globally. So there's a real imbalance in their human capital within the organization and their ability to address the problem. So the GIFCT is trying to sort of take the best practices and the capabilities created by these larger companies and spread that to smaller tech companies. Tech versus terrorism is the primary capability building arm of the GIFCT, and it works with small tech companies to try to help them adopt these best practices. But it's a massively, massively difficult problem, right? It's not just that some companies don't have the resources, the human capital. Others don't have an interest in engaging in any kind of content moderation because it violates the principles of that organization. They think that they exist for to create empowering opportunities for individuals, whether that's free speech or other capabilities that their platform provides, and they don't want to moderate content on it. Sometimes it's principled, and sometimes it's just opportunistic, and some organizations know full well that they're hosting content that's problematic, but they're making money off it, and that's enough. So it's a really, really difficult problem. The most success has been against formal propaganda produced by Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, right? Those formal propaganda videos are what's called hashed. The companies take basically a digital fingerprint of those videos. They share that hash across a hash sharing database, and other tech companies that are members of GIFCT can prevent videos with that digital fingerprint from ever being uploaded or from being transmitted. And so on formal propaganda for Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, they're doing pretty well. And the large companies have invested a lot of resources in trying to remove content and individuals. And so we know empirically that deplatforming individuals works to some extent, right? It does create a disincentive for individuals to keep coming back to those platforms. And so what we see are those who remain engaged go to often other smaller platforms. And from other smaller platforms, they have less reach, right? So they might be able to maintain their network, but they can't necessarily recruit as successfully from individuals who have no exposure to the movement previously. So, something like Twitter is really good for creating new audience, right? For bringing new people in. Telegram is not very good for that, but it's fine if you're trying to retain the individuals already inside, so to speak. So it's a mixed bag. What we know, for groups that are less, so for groups that are not on the UN sanctions list, right? A lot of tech companies are unwilling to, or don't have the resources to figure out who to just define as a terrorist organization or an individual. And so right now, all the tools that are being used for Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, they're not being used for white supremacists. They're not being used for Marxist extremists in India, right? So the tools are being used in a very narrow way. So there's a lot of room to make improvements globally and across different ideologies, as well as for the bottom-up content, the content that's not formal.
Great. So for the next question, I think I'm going to combine two similar questions. But first, what are some examples of ongoing marginalization programs or efforts, and which new strategies to marginalize extremist Islamic movements domestically do you see as most promising?
So there's an organization called Moonshot CVE that works with Google to redirect individuals who are searching for extremist content online towards other content. There's a version of it in which those individuals who are searching for extremist content are sent targeted ads for other sort of pro-social programming, whether that's mental health counseling or job training, educational opportunities. And what Moonshot has found is that among the community of individuals who are searching for extremist content, they have a higher click rate on those targeted ads for other kinds of empowering programs, right? So oftentimes when people are falling into violent extremist communities and content, they're looking for something, right? They're actively looking to be a part of something, or they're looking to fill a need. They're looking for some kind of significance, and other things can offer can serve those same needs. And so that's an example of providing an empowering alternative to violent empowerment, and actually having people click on it more at a higher rate than the population that's not searching for extremist content. So that would be one example of sort of trying to do this at a scale, right? Using tech tools to try to engage in programming at scale. You can contrast that with other programs where sort of former violent extremists now go out and do sort of community engagement, youth engagement, and try to share stories from their past to inoculate often young people against the attractiveness of these ideologies, right? So Kurt Braddock is doing great work on inoculation theory, which is a theory from communications that suggests that if you can get to people before they're exposed to a hazard with a credible messenger, and you can give that person enough information so they can come to their own conclusion about the hazard in question, right? Whether that's drugs or gangs or violent extremism. If they come to their own conclusion that is a problem, right? That drugs are bad, violent extremism is bad, et cetera. Years later, when they are exposed to that hazard, they're they're inoculated against it, because when they hear that recruiter try to tell them to join the white supremacist organization that they stand for, the person reacts negatively to it because they feel like this person is trying to manipulate me. I already have an opinion about this issue, and this person is trying to manipulate me. And so there's a psychological reactance to the violent extremist narrative. And so he's now testing this out on social media as well, to try to see if how well it translates into a, sort of the online space. So those are just two different examples of what some of these programs could look like. And then, sorry, what was the second question? No, I guess that did that.
Let me see. I think for our next question, do you see any changes in the financing activities of either Al Qaeda or the Islamic State? Any other than the ones regularly reported by the Financial Action Task Force, Interpol, or Europol? And what are the main financing methods that you've seen?
Sure. So terrorist organizations historically finance themselves by exploiting local populations. So we often are attracted to and sort of pay more attention to other more exotic forms of financing. So we're interested in the Hawala network and whether or not remittances from one country going back to family in a home country, if that's being diverted. So this is, in the case of Al-Shabaab, there was a lot of concern about this. But Al-Shabaab was making money off of selling firewood, illegal firewood sales, right? That's how they were making, at the Kismayu port, that's how they were making much of their funding. Terrorist organizations exploit local populations and local resources. They engage in both licit and illicit commercial activities on the ground. Even an organization like the Islamic State, was living off of the population despite having ransacked Iraqi banks and oil infrastructure, these sorts of things. So I think that'll always remain the primary source of funding for most organizations. They're exploitative, and that's worth prioritizing. However, in the last 6 months, and it may be more recent than that, last 3 months, the Treasury Department did break a really fascinating story about the use of Bitcoin by Al Qaeda, Islamic State, and Hamas, or cryptocurrencies. We saw fraudulent PPE schemes. The Islamic State created a website and was selling fraudulent PPE to U.S. first responders as a way to make money. So recently, the Marshall Center conducted interviews of professionals around the world who deal with these issues, and the survey results suggested that we are seeing, in the context of COVID-19, a greater crime terror nexus in terms of fundraising. So more use of online criminal behaviors than we'd seen in the past, potentially because extremist organizations have lesser access to populations to exploit, and so we're engaging in more creative forms of criminality. So I think that's a trend that will likely continue, right? As there are more and more tools available to us online that are empowering us to do more in different sort of financial transactions, extremists are going to use them just the same, right?
Sure. And before you mentioned Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and would you consider Al-Shabaab to still be affiliated with Al-Qaeda? And the asker notes that actions seem mostly located in Somalia and linked to elections.
Yes, this is a great example of Al-Qaeda's somewhat flexible strategy. Al-Shabaab was never a great subordinate for Al-Qaeda, but it doesn't have to be a great subordinate. It just has to be good enough. Every once in a while, there has to be an attack in Kenya at a mall or at a university in which non-Muslims are killed by Al-Shabaab. And when that happens, it makes our news cycle. So in the last 24 hours, Al-Shabaab conducted a suicide attack at a crowded marketplace, a crowded shop, and 20 individuals or so were killed. What Al-Qaeda needs is 1 out of 20, 1 out of 50 attacks to be of a kind that will make Western news media, and then that will sort of register subconsciously in our calculation about remaining engaged in countries around the world. So Shabab is not very tightly coupled with Al-Qaeda. It has always been mostly a Somali Islamist organization, and an organization that was fraught with clan competition and divisions. So factions of Shabab using Shabab to benefit a certain subclan. And it's only really been on occasion where Al-Qaeda has had senior leaders that were more loyal to Al-Qaeda's global jihad than to local Somali issues. But again, they don't have to be perfect subordinates to be useful for Al-Qaeda.
Sure. And kind of related to organizations' relationships with each other, what have you learned about Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State's relationship with different ideologically aligned extremists, such as far-right extremists in the United States?
So it's an interesting question. Certainly Al-Qaeda has demonstrated greater flexibility in partnering with organizations that were of different ideologies and even hostile ideologies. So famously, Al-Qaeda sent Saif al-Adil to train with Lebanese Hezbollah on how to conduct an attack that could bring down a building, right? So this was something that Hezbollah had done on multiple occasions. Al-Qaeda wanted to understand what kind of explosives and what kind of and how to locate those explosives in order to take a building down. And that ultimately led to the East African Embassy bombings and their success. So that would be that's one very notable example of Al-Qaeda being more willing to, at a tactical level, work with an organization that it is morally opposed to, right? Hezbollah is a Shia organization. I haven't seen any indication of any kind of collaboration with violent far-right extremists. What we are seeing is some mimicry, right? So we're seeing Islamic State supporters, adherents, use similar kinds of memes as violent far-right extremists have been using, right? These are things that are hard to moderate if you're a content moderator. Is it a joke? Is it just pop culture? Is it, if it's not directly espousing violence, does it violate our terms of use? And we've seen sort of violent far-right extremists in the United States use somewhat humorous memes to great effect to reach new audiences, to avoid content moderation policies. And we're starting to see that kind of behavior from Islamic State followers. So that's of concern. We also see that, and have seen, it's not really new, but violent far-right extremists in the United States traveling to network with other violent far-right groups overseas and to participate in conflict zones overseas. And so Ukraine would be, the sort of case in point. And that same kind of phenomenon that I talked about with Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, right? You go into a conflict zone, you socialize and network in that environment, and then you come back to either your home country or you go to the next conflict zone, but you come with the gravitas of being a veteran of that conflict and having that network at your disposal. And so this idea of foreign fighters and conflict zones is not somehow unique to Muslim extremists. It's something that we should be quite concerned about. But again, that's not the same as sort of collaboration or close contact.
And how likely is it, do you think, that a new group might arise from one of these affiliates or from the movement generally, like we saw with ISIS in 2013?
Yeah, I think with dozens of groups, it's unfortunately likely. And in fact, we've already seen, right, in Marawi in the Philippines, a months-long battle over a city by an ISIS affiliate that was able to keep the military and law enforcement community at bay for months. So with this many options out there, I think it's very likely that we will see one or two or three, right, at different points in time, gain some kind of success at either destabilizing a city or a region, or even a government. And I guess the problem is we don't, it's really, I think, difficult to predict what set of either good luck or skill might arrive at that, right? It's just hard to predict. The other potentiality that I sort of mentioned earlier that I said I would talk about, I didn't. If Saif al-Adil becomes al-Qaeda's third emir, and he seems to be the most likely candidate, again, he had a very close relationship with Zarqawi compared with others in al-Qaeda core. And Zarqawi always said that Zarqawi's group was loyal to bin Laden, not to Ayman al-Zawahiri, al-Qaeda's at the time #2, and then erstwhile emir. Saif al-Adil was also quite loyal to bin Laden and not a fan of Zawahiri. So part of the rivalry between al-Qaeda and the Islamic State was over Zawahiri's leadership. Most of it was over Zarqawi's really departing from al-Qaeda's playbook. But again, he did so in consultation and to some extent by the guidance of Saif al-Adil to go to Iraq, and then if possible to use Syria as a base for jihad, because Saif al-Adil understood that the United States was not going to support the Assad regime against a jihadi threat in Syria. Right? The United States didn't have a positive relationship with the Assad regime. So unlike in other countries in which the United States would support the government against the jihadist organization, Saif al-Adil accurately predicted that we wouldn't do that in Syria. And so sure enough, Zarqawi's group years later was able to do just that, reconstitute itself in the context of the Syrian war. And while the United States did go after extremists in Syria, the hardcore Islamic State type folks in Syria, it didn't empower the Assad regime, didn't work with the Assad regime, and really, was much less hands-on in Syria than it would have been in other locations. And so the point here is that there's enough connective tissue between Zarqawi and Zarqawi and Saif al-Adil that Saif al-Adil may be able to serve as a kind of unifying figure in a way that Zawahiri was not. And we might see continued competition in certain locations between rival groups that are affiliated with al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, but we might see others that are actually able to find common cause. And so that's another way that it's hard to sort of predict what will happen going forward.
And focusing on ISIS in particular, what is the status and impact of the EMNI on global affiliates, particularly with their capacity to conduct more complex attacks in their respective regions?
So it's a good question. I'm not, I don't have a lot of insight into the current status of EMNI and how operational it is outside of Iraq and Syria. I think we're all very concerned about the continued capacity in Iraq and Syria to conduct, to launch attacks in other places. But outside of Iraq and Syria, I don't have a lot of insight. I'm sorry.
Sure. It's okay. We don't expect you to have all the questions, only some of them. So our next question, has ISIS and al-Qaeda changed their recruiting techniques as a result of counterterrorism pressure? And for example, as their territorial footholds and influences dwindle, are these groups more willing to allow women to assume militant roles? So there have been instances of al-Qaeda affiliates using women as or allowing women to serve as fighters. So the primary example is the Black Widows in Chechnya. These are the individuals whose either sons or husbands had been killed and then conducted these acts of suicide terrorism and revenge.
So it's happened, and it certainly can happen. In the Islamic State's case, they did use women as fighters towards the end, as they were losing, sort of in a last-ditch effort. And we've seen women play active roles within the morality police, or HESPA, which it also engages in violence against local populations in order to enforce their interpretation of Sharia. So we might not understand that as a fighter, a traditional terrorist fighter, but they're certainly engaging in ideological violence against civilian populations. Whether or not that's how that will manifest in the dozens of places around the world where these groups are operating, I think it's more a function of local context than it is about the ISIS or Al-Qaeda brand, right? So I think it's certainly possible that we'll see it in some locations and not in others. But traditionally, the overwhelming majority of individuals engaging in violence have been men. So I think that's very likely to remain true.
Sure. And kind of continuing with the discussion of recruitment, what is your view on addressing the possible, I'm sorry, let me ask the right question that I was looking at. How does Al-Qaeda's online use and propaganda compare to the Islamic State's? Does it have the same amount of skill in producing and disseminating propaganda and the use of social media and internet as the Islamic State?
So the answer is no, but we often, I think, forget that Al-Qaeda and its affiliated organizations did engage in a lot of innovation that sort of opened the door for the Islamic State. And frankly, the social media companies are also providing more and more capability. So, for example, Shabab was one of the first organizations to use Twitter. And basically what they would do is, in the immediate aftermath of an attack, they would tweet about that attack and frame it in the way that was helpful for their organization before traditional media organizations were able to write a news story about it and publish that news story in a newspaper. And so they were able to speak first about these issues using Twitter. The Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, gained notoriety for publishing the English language Inspire magazine, which was sort of a print version of the glossy high production videos that the Islamic State would then put out, as well as the magazines that the Islamic State would put out, very much in the image of Inspire magazine, right? So those are two examples of Al-Qaeda really creating new covering new ground, and then the Islamic State adopting it. A third would be more on the ideological side. So also in Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Anwar al-Awlaki did a lot to democratize jihadist propaganda. So he would encourage individuals to create their own propaganda, to be their own propaganda organs on behalf of the movement, that it was good and right to participate in jihad of that kind, as well as in violence. And so he really created this do-it-yourself propaganda sort of movement within Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula's followers. Islamic State would take that and run with it, right? Famously stating that an 18-year-old on the ground fighting in the Islamic State has more greater claim on piety than an armchair cleric outside of a war zone. Basically empowering that 18-year-old to not just create propaganda, but to speak with religious authority because of their proximity to the fight. That's what made you pious. That's what gave you religious authority. And so the Islamic State was able to sort of take Anwar al-Awlaki's democratization of propaganda, imbue it with religious credentials proven by the fact that you were in the fight, and then give that individual a cell phone and tell them to have at it. So there's a lot more continuity, I guess, in the story. It's not like the Islamic State just sort of came out of nowhere with its production propaganda capabilities.
Sure. And kind of shifting conversation to countering extremism, what's your view on addressing the possible root causes of terrorist violence and radicalization? such as group grievances or societal, political, economic injustices, and maybe in parallel to marginalization efforts?
I think it's critically important, and I don't want to. I'm not saying that poverty causes crime, right? That argument is so I think critics often make that argument that dealing with enabling factors is a waste of resources because we know that things like poverty don't cause terrorism. There are a lot of poor communities that don't engage in terrorism. Therefore, addressing poverty doesn't make sense as counterterrorism best practice. I think that's a specious argument. I think that they're not. I actually don't prefer the term root cause because that suggests causality, but it is very much true that that things like a lack of empowerment make it much easier for an extremist organization or movement to offer violent empowerment and have that be attractive, right? So I think it's critically important to build the protective factors around an individual, a family, and a community to decrease the vulnerabilities that individual or community has to the appeal or to the attractiveness of violent extremism. And poverty is not necessarily sort of the top of my list. There are other issues, other enabling factors, which I think are more important. But at the end of the day, terrorist groups have to sell victimhood in order to sell violent empowerment as a solution. If they sell victimhood to a community that doesn't feel that they are either individually or collectively victimized, that they instead feel empowered, that they feel that they can protect themselves and they can have a meaningful life, all these sorts of things, that violent empowerment is just much less attractive. So I think it's really important, a very important part of this overall empowerment grand strategy is inoculating individuals against that victimhood narrative, so that individuals are don't then buy violent empowerment. If you think about the white supremacist movement again in the United States, the narrative is that there is a white genocide underway, that soon you will not be able to have a white identity, or there won't be any such thing as white identity, because it's being taken from us by immigration, by interracial marriage, by affirmative action policies. So they first have to sell white genocide and the great replacement, the idea that white men are being replaced by others in the society, in order to then sell white supremacy or white nationalism or white power as the solution, right? So this, I think it's critically important to address the victimhood narratives and make them less appealing.
Sure. And earlier you mentioned that messages from the majority community can marginalize extremists must be delivered from someone with appropriate authority. And who, when we're looking at violent jihad, violent Islamist extremism, who might have the necessary authority today?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Sunni Islam is a decentralized faith system. So there's no papacy. There's no equivalent to the Pope. Instead, individuals are followed if they're deemed to be credible at a very sort of individual kind of level. And if I don't necessarily need to just follow one Sunni cleric on all matters for all time. I can seek guidance from different Sunni clerics over time and on different issues, and I can follow the guidance that I think has the most credibility. So it's a highly decentralized faith system, which makes this the answer to your question challenging. Right? There's not one person who can condemn the Islamic State and Al Qaeda and have that matter for the people who decide that Al Qaeda and the Islamic State are credible. However, clearly there are ways to, there are individuals who do speak with authority that can push back and do push back on these groups. So, I mean, one of the most famous examples of this with respect to the Islamic State was the King of Jordan, who basically convened, at first dozens of luminaries across the Sunni clerical world to issue a fatwa against the Islamic State. and then sort of built that out over time with other political leaders. And so created a real broad coalition of voices pushing back on the so-called Islamic State. So there are mainstream voices that I think are useful, but aren't going to necessarily reach those who are on the extreme or who don't see governments and traditional clerics as legitimate, right? If for those folks, it's going to be harder to reach. For those individuals, it's often either highly conservative, puritanical preachers who speak out against the state and traditional Muslim scholars, but also critique the jihadi community. They might have more sway because they might be seen as more trusted. And then similarly, there are individual clerics who are supportive of some kind of violent jihad, but condemn groups like the Islamic State. And a great example of that would be Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, who's a Jordanian cleric who is quite famous as a extremist cleric, but who still condemns Islamic State violence. And so, again, not that you want to promote his voice necessarily because he's an extremist, but there are different messengers for different audiences that are more effective.
Okay, great. We've got about 2 minutes left, and we do have 2 lengthy questions left. So I think I'll just stick with the first question in each of them. So first, any idea how the pandemic has affected these groups?
So we don't have, our global terrorism database team is working on 2020 data now, and they saw in the first few months, the downward trend had continued into the first few months of this year. That's a 6-year trend or 7-year trend at this point in time. But we can't really attribute it yet to the pandemic. It's sort of too early to say. There were a couple places where terrorist violence has gone up because of pandemic related issues, but that's not in the Muslim extremist space. That's more like in the United States, our domestic extremist movements. In the United Kingdom, we saw it increase, I think, as well. So I think it's too early to know empirically whether or not our worst fears about increased levels of terrorist violence during COVID-19, to the extent that that really played out. Instead, what we these groups both spent a lot of time online trying to convince people that this was divine, God's will and punishment for sins against God and these sorts of things. So we saw a lot of hay being made in the propaganda space, but I think the short answer is for Islamic State, this was very helpful for allowing them to reconstitute to some degree. That we saw the government's ability to sort of pursue them decreased because of the pandemic, but it didn't necessarily generate an uptick in violence. It just meant that I think an uptick in survivability for the group.
Sure. And I think this will be our last question, but of course, anyone attending is welcome to reach out to Bill after the event if you have any pressing questions that you would like answered. So for our last question, what impact would you say that competition has on the trajectory of violence perpetrated by both organizations?
So, I mean, I guess my concern is that on the ground, it creates an incentive for individual leaders who might not be great students of bin Laden or great students of anyone else to feel like they need to increase the level of violence in order to outcompete the other organizations. So I mean, my concern is that in some locations, it's going to lead to higher levels of destabilizing violence. It might also impact, right, if groups are turning their guns on one another, which is another potential outcome, it might undermine their ability to be strategically successful, right? Because now their efforts are distracted or they're being undercut by one another. But there can still be a lot of collateral damage, right? As they turn guns on each other, there will be civilians who are killed in the crossfire, so to speak. And so I think the idea that this competition between groups is good because it distracts them from advancing their mission otherwise, can be both true and problematic for the local population that might pay the price. So I guess we'll end it there.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. I think this is a fantastic talk.
Thanks everybody for your time.
Thank you to all of our attendees for coming today. If you like this event, you're welcome to join us for one of our future events. And I dropped the link to our events page on our website, so you can check out those later on. And so everyone, thank you and have a good day.